Innovate BC. We were just talking earlier, Innovate BC and Links to Learning. They're coming to an end at the end of March. So take in all this goodness, this knowledge while you can. We're honored that you're here. So I always I feel that it's important just to take a moment, plant those feet on the ground, maybe close the eyes, take a deep breath. And we just want to give thanks to Creator for the gift of another day. As that sun rises in the east, Creator's meeting us and giving us another opportunity to walk, this land, to walk creation, to walk in our communities, to walk in whatever gifts that we have to bring to the world, to walk and play and do all of the good things. So we give thanks to Creator for the gift of this moment that we can actually meet virtually. I'm joining from Amiskwaci, Waskaga, so Edmonton Treaty 6. Our guest speaker, he's joining from Manitoba. I know Ken, and our good friend, our good family, Ken's joining us from all the way in Ontario. I see Smithers, BC is here. Also Fort Simpson. Regina is in the house. So we're, so blessed to be able to come together and be able to meet this way and learn. And I always say to be inspired as well. We always love to hear the story. So welcome. Let's get on with the show, shall we? It is Indigenizing the Cooperative Model. So this webinar today will explore how Indigenous cultures and the cooperative can be molded together to create a model that is reflective of the values, principles, and aspirations of Indigenous peoples. So this webinar is based on a research project published by the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives that aims at encouraging urban Indigenous communities to consider the cooperative model as a community economic development tool that may create opportunities for income generation while maintaining independence through self-determination. So a couple of weeks ago, we had hosted, I think, Cooperatives First, and they had talked about their cooperative model as well. So if this is being recorded. All of the other sessions were recorded and they're on Candu's website. So go and search and have a look if this is something that's of interest to you, because there's a lot of different webinars on the cooperative model. All right, so our guest speaker is joining us, as I said, from Manitoba, Winnipeg, Manitoba, Jimmy Thunder. He is currently working as the Director of Economic Development for Norway House Cree Nation and also teaching Indigenous economic leadership at the University of Manitoba. He's a trained facilitator with the Indigenous Leadership Development Institute. He actively encourages public engagement with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action as in the Horizon College and Seminary, and via social media as co-founder of the Reconciliation Thunder. Such important work. So as a result of speaking publicly in these contexts, he's been invited into post-secondary institutions and community organizations as a consultant on matters related to cultural awareness and anti-racism and inclusion. So here he is today joining us. We're so honored, so grateful that you could make time for us in your busy world and the important work that you're doing. So we are very appreciative of you being here and just look forward to the knowledge and the story that you're going to share with us this afternoon. So Jimmy, the floor is yours.
Awesome. Thank you much. Thank you so much, Michelle. Kichimigwech. Bonjour, Jimmy Nindishikaz, Sachiko Lake Nindunji. My name is Jimmy Thunder, and I am from Sachiko Lake First Nation. That's my nation where I'm from, Treaty 9 territory. And as Michelle said, I'm currently working for Norway House Cree Nation, and I'm joining you guys here from Winnipeg, which is on Treaty 1 territory. Today, I'm going to be talking to you about some research that we've done on indigenizing the cooperative model. This research was done as a partnership between myself and Mark Ingertes, And I want to acknowledge his contribution to the work, as it was a co-written publication, and yeah, definitely learned a lot from him, and vice versa. Our advisors on this project is the late Dr. John Loxley and Elder Kathy Mallet. So we want to acknowledge their contributions to the research as well. So we talked a little bit about who I am: Director of Economic Development, public speaker on reconciliation, adjunct faculty teaching on reconciliation, Indigenous economic leadership, and so on. I have my MBA from the University of Manitoba, and also I'm a certified associate in project management. And so this is the co-researcher who wrote the article with me. His name is Mark Intertes. At the time he wrote it, he was the articling student at DD West LLP. He completed his research work on the community economic development during his master's thesis in city planning. And so his focus was actually on the cooperative model. And he's been very interested in Indigenous law. And so yeah, it was, so the partnership between him and I on the article was one that was very helpful. And yeah, both learned a lot from each other. So acknowledging that. So this is the research. So this is what we're talking about today. We had a number of research questions that we set out for when we were doing the research and writing the article. First question here is, how might an indigenized cooperative model influence the Indigenous communities in Winnipeg? And so that was the focus. That was the focus of the research. Was we were looking at like urban economic development. We're looking at Indigenous communities in Winnipeg, where they're come from, what kind of Indigenous peoples are there, and so on. And we're looking at spurring on economic development by looking at that model. Another research question we had was, how does the cooperative model fit with Indigenous cultures? And we pluralized that. There's no pan-Indigenous culture. Indigenous cultures vary from the different locations all across Canada. And so the research takes that into account. How many and what type of cooperatives are currently organized in Indigenous communities? Why are there not more Indigenous cooperatives in Winnipeg? And what might an Indigenized cooperative model look like? So there's so this sort of sets up the big picture of what the research was and what we were trying to do. So so that's what it is. And I want to talk a little bit before we proceed about what it is not. So what are we not covering in this presentation? And so this is not a technical how-to presentation. And I think that it's likely if cooperatives first did a presentation, that's probably likely where you would go. And so I would think that if you are interested in the cooperative model after this presentation, definitely recommend checking that out. It's also not a framework. We wanted to avoid putting a framework together. So the research, especially as we were going and doing our interviews and putting the research together, we wanted something that was descriptive rather than proscriptive. And it's really important when we look at Indigenous self-determination that we're not coming up with a framework that says like this is how an Indigenous cooperative model should look like. Rather, we're recognizing that an Indigenous cooperative could look almost infinitely different ways. And so what we were setting out to do with the research was to describe the trends of what this model could look like generally. So that was what we were trying to put together. But even aside from that, there are other uses to the research that we're going to be talking about here today. The principles that we discussed are useful for just general economic development strategic thinking, because we're looking at some of these core principles like our values, our principles, the economy, and how Indigenous peoples work within this our current capitalist economy, and so on. So there's a lot of takeaways from the research that may not directly that can apply to economic development outside of the use of the cooperative model. Also, we do mention here that the research was intended for Winnipeg, but because our model is descriptive rather than prescriptive, there is value for economic development outside of the Winnipeg context. Our research is specifically the urban Winnipeg context, but the value of the model and what we'll be talking about is, I would say, of value elsewhere as well, outside of that context. So with that, one of the most important principles guiding our research and our research approach and methodologies was this concept of two-eyed seeing. And we first came across this in our research when we were looking at the final report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And what this is a blending of Indigenous and non-Indigenous ways of knowing. And so this was an important part of our methodology, right down to the number of researchers. There was two. There was myself as an Indigenous researcher and Mark, who is non-Indigenous. We had our advisors, Indigenous and non-Indigenous. We had our advisory committee that was a blend of Indigenous and non-Indigenous. Our key interviewees were also a blend of Indigenous and non-Indigenous. So it was really important that we were, recognizing that we're pulling in models from both ways of knowing. But what we didn't want to do was we didn't want to just take a non-Indigenous concept and just sort of, reverse engineer it into looking like it was Indigenous. So that was sort of what we were looking to. That was our hopes and goals in the research. So we began with an extensive literature review on Indigenous cultures and co-ops. So in the research, we talk about the history of colonialism and oppression, because it's really imperative that we begin with that. I think that the context in which we find ourselves and the current state of our economy and looking at how our current state has been shaped by colonial policies such as the Indian Act and that kind of thing it's essential for understanding where we place ourselves and where we situate our research. Also, self-determination and self-governance. We did a lot of we covered a lot of work by Dr. David Newhouse, who is defining self-governance over Dr. David Newhouse says that if you look at all the Indigenous voices and if you were to create a meta-narrative of all of the Indigenous leaders from initial contact until today, you can see sort of like this seamless thread of the basic motif of self-governance and this idea of doing life well together. And self-governance, self-determination is an essential part of that. We see that referenced in early treaties, such as the Truro Wampum Belt between the Haudenosaunee and the Dutch, and move forward all the way through the covenant chain of friendship and up until today. The importance of self-governance and self-determination is important. Also, Indigenous cultures. So a brief description on what that is, and describing Métis, Inuit, and First Nation as distinct Indigenous identities, especially for those readers who are not familiar with what we mean when we're talking about these terms. Also looking at the materialist versus ideational sociological perspectives as we look at different themes in Indigenous cultures. So as we sort of transition then into the research, I'd like to highlight some of the correlation between CED principles and the Indian Act. So CED principles, I'll talk about a little bit later in the presentation, but they are here in Manitoba, we have the community economic development principles, and there are a number of principles that describe some of the goals and objectives of community economic development work. And so that's the branch of economic development that looks specifically at the social dynamics of the community. And when we look at larger documents that are meant to describe economic development objectives across Canada, things such as the National Indigenous Economic Strategy, the CED principles would fall very much in line with like the people component of that national strategy. And so here in this chart, I want to quickly look at how these principles that we sort of outlined as our measures of success for building a healthy community. For each and every one of them, you can find a correlating policy in the Indian Act. And so what this does is it highlights how the Indian Act has sort of been systematically engineered to destroy our economies as Indigenous peoples and as Indigenous nations, companies, and so on. So as an example, this first one of the principles is the use of local goods and services. The Indian Act created the permit system, the system by which it was impossible for us to buy or sell anything without a permit from the Indian agent. The production of goods and services for local use. And so the related policy of the Indian Act is the peasant farming policy. So this idea that, as First Nations people, as Indigenous peoples, we had to be gradually civilized. And so we were prevented from using labor-saving implements, which prevented us from some of the important aspects of the early development of the Canadian economy. Local reinvestment of products, so the creation of reserves, which prevented the ability for us as sovereign nations to reinvest in ourselves. Long-term employment of local residents. The Indian Act created, again, the permit system, where an external party made the decisions in terms of employment and decisions on the nation. Local skill development. The Indian Act had the enforced enfranchisement of people who attended university. Local decision-making and ownership. The Indian Act enabled government to reclaim reserve lands and prohibited anyone from soliciting funds for First Nation legal claims. Healthy people is another principle. The Indian Act produced residential schools, healthy physical environment. Under the Indian Act, government can lease out uncultivated reserve lands. And a special note here, nowadays we know about UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, which calls for the free, prior, and informed consent of those nations before their environment or lands or resources are used. Neighborhood stability is another goal. And again, we look at the past system, we look historically at a time when First Nations people could not leave their First Nation without a pass. Human dignity is another one. And for each of these principles, I'm only going really lightly through all of these corresponding principles, but there's a significantly large amount that could be said for each of these. But basically, under the Indian Act, it forbade First Nations from speaking their own language, forbade Western First Nations from appearing publicly in their regalia. Another principle is support for other CED projects, and the Indian Act forbade First Nations from forming political organizations. So these CED principles, which we're now today using as a model for building our economy and for strengthening our communities, we can see, just as the example, just looking at the Indian Act and just looking for these first couple minutes, it's starkly clear that the Canadian government has systematically put us at a disadvantage. And so when we're looking at the modern context of economic development, it's important to look at, Indigenous goals are rooted in our post-colonial history. So with that as our research and setting that as our context, we began to do additional research. And so we had community consultation. We had a series of interviews. So we chose some key informants that were both Indigenous and non-Indigenous, respected leaders in areas of economic development, the cooperative model, and Indigenous cultures. We interviewed elders. And so we use this as an important primary research areas in order to inform and answer some of our research questions. In addition to that, we had a design workshop. And so what we did in this model of research, we invited some community members together. We wanted to make sure we had a variety. We wanted to have a blend of male, female. We wanted to have a variety of age groups. And we just sort of put them together and And we just told them, like, so what are some things that you'd like to see in the community? What are some products? What are some services? And how are in what ways do you see these things coming about? If you guys had, you know, X number of dollars and the resources available to do it, design how you would see these products or services come to your community. And so in this design workshop, Indigenous participants, they conceptually designed a cooperative. The participants planned their enterprises and incorporated Indigenous culture and values. And so what we found in all of these different groups is that they invariably showed not only signs of developing like a social enterprise, but they all showed signs of cooperatives, so cooperative leanings. And this is prior to us explaining to them what a cooperative was. Because we had found also in our research that specifically in Manitoba, the knowledge of the cooperative as a model for building businesses is not widely known. Most people who think of starting a business as an entrepreneur or what have you in Manitoba, they might think of a sole proprietorship or a partnership, limited partnership, or a corporation, but rarely will they think of the cooperative. And even further, people in our study group that we were looking for, prior to our workshop, they couldn't really articulate what a cooperative actually was and what it meant. So, so putting these together, we found it very interesting that they made the decisions and they organized themselves in the way that they did. So looking further at our research, one of the research questions was how many co-ops are there in urban Winnipeg as compared to other areas? And so this chart here is Indigenous co-op membership per capita. So if you look at this chart, you can see that we're fairly low when compared to Northwest Territories and Saskatchewan, but more or less, you know, around we blend in, I guess, with some of the other areas, and so this was unique, and we were looking at some of the reasons why this might be. So as I mentioned before, we were one of the main areas that we're looking at was the 7 principles and the 11 Nietzsche principles. So the 7 CED principles, community economic development principles, are listed here below. And we also found the 11 Nietzsche principles. And so the Nietzsche principles were principles created by a cooperative, an Indigenous-owned cooperative in Winnipeg called Nietzsche Commons. And so they sort of designed their own principles of what they understood community economic development to be and what were the principles that guided their practice. So in this slide here, I'm just going to look again at what the 7 community economic development principles are. The first is voluntary and open membership. It's open for anybody who's interested and anybody who wants to join, they're able to. Democratic member control. So it's the members who control the decisions of the organization. So they have that self-determination at that level. Number 3 is financial or economic participation by members. So all members have financial and economic decision-making ability. Number 4 is autonomy and independence. So they have the ability to make decisions independent of outside and external influence. Number 5 was education, training, and information for members. So there's this idea of continuous improvement, a continuous growth, and continuous development of all their members. Number 6, cooperation with other cooperatives. So recognizing that when cooperatives work together, they strengthen and support each other. And that's where you have organizations that are like cooperatives of other cooperatives. Number 7 was concern for the community. And so when we look at these 7 principles, so these 7 principles, they come from way back when the cooperative movement initially had started, and they more or less define what the cooperative movement is. So when we compare this with the 11 Nietzsche principles, you can see a lot of similarity and a lot of overlap. So Nietzsche Commons, as I mentioned, created these 11 principles, and you can see similarities even as we go through them. Use of locally produced goods and services, the production of goods and services for local use, local reinvestment of profits, long-term employment of residents, local skills development, local decision-making, public health, physical environment. And so when we're talking about physical environment, we're looking at a healthy and safe physical environment, neighborhood stability, so creating a neighborhood in which people can stay for a long term, develop connections, develop social capital, and be able to grow and enhance themselves. Number 10 is human dignity. And number 11 is support for other CED initiatives. So there's a lot of similarities between the two. So the other thing that we wanted to talk about is looking at the question of, can Indigenous cultures and Indigenous values thrive in a capitalist economy? Because one of the reasons why the co-op movement existed in the first place is sort of in defiance of the rise of capitalism. You know, in those early days, in the early movement of the origins of the cooperative model. So I just want to talk a little bit about Indigenous participation in the capitalist economy. So what we found here is an element of success model. So this was developed by Salway Black in 1994. It's a medicine wheel inspired framework that measures the success of economic development using 16 elements. One of the main writers that we refer to quite a bit is Dr. David Newhouse, and he talks about this concept, capitalism with a red face. And his argument is that whether or not Indigenous values or principles can sort of thrive in whether or not the Indigenous values and principles can be merged with a capitalist worldview. It's important to note that we are in a capitalist economy. We have a capitalist economy. Capitalism is around us. And so what he presented in this concept of capitalism with the red face, so how do we do that? How do we preserve our values? How do we preserve our culture? And so in his article, he gives a number of reasons, a number of methods in terms of how we do that. And so when we look at that concept, you know, capitalism is here. So how do we shape it? How do we shape the organizations and our strategies for economic development? We need to create models that define what we want to see, because it's not just about the bottom line and creating wealth, and that's not what successful economic development is. In some cases, it could be part of it, but we need to have a model that shows what success actually is, and that's where this model comes in. It's defining what successful economic development is. It's instead of it just being this one single metric, we have 16 different metrics that measure the success of a business, of an entity, of a corporation. And so this can be used in our context today when we're talking about the cooperative model, but it's also useful for any type of economic development. When you create a model that defines all the different areas of your community, your society, your business that you want to measure, and you create KPIs related to each of these metrics, essentially this is what you're doing. You're looking at how to preserve Indigenous values and Indigenous traditions in your economic development initiatives. So really quickly, as we look through each of these, I just want to talk about the four pillars here. We have control of assets, we have personal efficacy, we have kinship, and we have spirituality. So, and related to these, you have all the different metrics in between. So the control of assets is the closest one related to that one metric I was talking about. So like return return on your investment, and the bottom line, just having the ability to control the assets that you own. Spirituality is a really important part of economic development, and in a whole lot of research in terms of successful entrepreneurship and business development, spirituality does play a role in the success factors of a lot of successful Indigenous entrepreneurs, whether it was through the cooperative model or not. Kinship is a wide concept. It's not just the people around you, but it's also the nature. It's this concept that is translated all my relations in different languages, and also personal efficacy. So just that realization of who you are as an individual in relation to the world and creation, the creator, and everything around you. So here's a quick visual summary of what we're talking about when we talk about indigenizing the cooperative model. In the next couple slides, I'm going to be showing how there is a huge correlation between Salway Black's model of economic development, successful economic development, the Rochdale co-op principles, which are the 7 original principles of the cooperative model, and the Nietzsche community economic development principles. So when we look at all 3 of these different areas, and we see the large number of overlap with each of them, you can see this is sort of a description of what an indigenized cooperative model could look like. It's where we are now taking control of our organization that exists within this capitalist economy, and we're defining success on our own terms. So in this case, we're looking at control of assets, which is empowerment through the use of assets and wealth creation, environmental balance, hope and future orientation, and choices or vision. And in Salway Black's model, she speaks about how in many cases, Indigenous cultures have a lot farther reaching scope of defining success than non-Indigenous. And the example is return on investment as an example. They're typically maybe quarterly, maybe annually. That's essentially what we're talking about when we're setting goals based on ROI and those types of metrics. But the Indigenous worldview is typically a much longer focus, looking at generations to follow. And 7 generations principle is another concept as an example. So looking at what decisions, the decisions we make, how do the decisions we make affect those 7 generations ahead of us? And so when we're talking about the use of assets, we're looking at those types of things, those big picture questions. Spirituality. Spirituality is the Indigenous vision of oneself, the understanding of our place in the community, an understanding of our place in creation. It's about cultural integrity. It's about social respect. And it's about political and civic responsibilities. So this is sort of Salway Black's definition of spirituality, and what we're measuring. What are the hoped for outcomes of our economic development engagements? And again, you can see this overlap between the Rochdale principles and the Nietzsche principles. Kinship was the other category. It's the acknowledgement of a system of giving and sharing and reciprocity that exists within Indigenous communities. It's health and safety. It's responsibility and consequences. And it talks about vibrant initiative, and that concept of vibrant initiative is that feeling that you get when you realize that the decisions and actions that I make today in my small sphere of influence actually affect my kin. And we see this vibrant initiative sort of destroyed by the Indian Act, where you see this, you see phenomena like people having this low concern for others. They may go to work and just think about their own sphere of influence and not have that vibrant initiative. But as a result of this meeting these goals and successful economic development, every individual can see that they're actually connected. They're an integral part of the whole. They are a piece, as some Indigenous leaders say, they're an essential piece of the whole. And when they can see how they are part of the whole, then they're much more motivated to achieve the objectives of their section of the co-op or the business or whatever it is, and for each of those sections to achieve the objectives of their organization, to achieve the objectives of the community. And again, within this kinship framework, we can see a lot of overlap with the Rochdale principles and overlap with almost all of the Nietzsche principles. And lastly, we're looking at personal efficacy. So this is personal growth and the development for the purpose of benefiting others. It's productivity skills, it's income, and it's trade and exchange. So even though we're looking at personal efficacy, even though you're looking at yourself and you're looking at your own growth, you're not growing for your own benefit, as may be the case in the outcome of capitalism, because as David Newhouse explains, capitalism it's a worldview, it's a way of life, it's a paradigm. But in our case, when instead of looking through this that framework where we're benefiting ourselves as much as possible for our own personal benefit, our growth is still for the purpose of benefiting those around us. And so we see personal growth and development for the sake of benefiting others, productivity skills, income, trade and exchange. All of these things have an overlap with the majority of these Rochdale co-op principles, and again, with the Nietzsche community economic development principles. So in conclusion, as we're talking about the overview of our findings, we wrote our findings that the cooperative could be a valuable option in a lot of contexts. We can, when we look at the research, and when it comes to those individuals, First Nation, Inuit, or Métis individuals who are starting businesses as entrepreneurs, the cooperative model has overall a better longevity. It has a higher ability to withstand some of the challenges that would cause businesses to shut down. It can mobilize the community to lend support because a cooperative is owned by everybody. So everybody feels a sense of ownership in the co-op. So there's the strength with that model. It plugs the leaky bucket. It prevents capital flight and benefits from the multiplier effect. So by its very definition of what it is, it's meant to keep profits within the community, and however you define community, it keeps the profits within the people, and it multiplies the the benefits from the work that is doing by just keeping all of the revenues and everything circulating within that community. The model works well in circumstances and places where private sector cannot and will not service. So for example, northern communities. And so in our research, we found that this was very valuable for a lot of northern communities. So some challenges for implementation. One of the biggest challenges that we found in our context was familiarity with the cooperative model. As I mentioned earlier, when people are thinking that they want to start businesses, that they want to solve problems in their community, they're not necessarily thinking about the cooperative model. They might think of a corporation, or they might think of sole proprietorship. And this was the case even with our research group, that even though they began to create a model that had a lot of similarities with the cooperative model, they weren't aware of what the cooperative model was until we explained to them, and so that was one of the findings. Also, access to startup capital. So this is true across the board for all entrepreneurs, Indigenous entrepreneurs. It's a challenge. Current social factors in the community within and between members. We found that this is a challenge for implementing a co-op. Risk of failure. So community investors may be affected. And in addition to this, there were other challenges for implementation. One of the challenges for implementation is just finding investors that would be interested in putting the cooperative together, but still want to retain control. So an example was an investor that wanted to build the capital costs of setting up a cooperative and wanted the cooperative to rent from that space, but still wanted to have a say in the operations of the cooperative, which is antithetical to why the cooperative exists in the first place. So so those are some things that I've seen after the research has been completed and published. Further along with the conclusion, alignment with Indigenous ways of finding solutions. So we found that community goals incorporated with the cooperation. So the example of Nietzsche Commons. So it's a great example in Winnipeg of community goals incorporating just right within the very fabric of the organization itself. The village concept. So this was an idea of acceptance, equality, and community. So one of the people that we interviewed was Michael Redhead Champagne, who in Winnipeg is a known activist in the community. And he introduced this village concept, and also and to this point below here, the privileged potlatch, the idea of sharing gifts and blessings. So it's looking at, you know, what a potlatch and the principles of a potlatch could apply to today, recognizing that we all have different gifts and we all have different opportunities to give to the community. And it's not until we come together that we realize where our gifts and strengths can come together to make the whole better and where we can multiply ourselves. Leadership in the community. So there was no lack of this, and it's essential in creating a co-op. So as we did our research there was no lack of leadership. There were great people that were willing to jump in and solve problems. And as we did the research, this was something that we were really happy to see. So that being the case, I'm going to turn it over for some questions. I think that one of the most important parts of these presentations are the questions and the discussions at the end. So with that, yeah, look forward to hearing any questions that you might have.
Question from Hopeton here. Thank you so much for the presentation. You're a good teacher.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely. When you were doing your group in Winnipeg, I find it interesting that it appears that the co-op practice appeared naturally.
Mm-hmm.
Why do you think that's the case? Is it innate to Indigenous people more so than the Western culture?
Yeah, you know what I think it is? I think it's because of all the things that we talked about in the beginning, because we're situating ourselves in a post-colonial context. So we're trying to, when we're thinking about problems in the community, we recognize that it's because of colonialism, and we're trying to fix things. And so I think that's part of it. Part of it is this context. The other part of it is culture, and I think that, so in our case, we had a mixture of Cree and OG Cree specifically, and so our sample size was limited to that. And so I think that we also in our research have to be careful not to extrapolate too far, right? So these are just sort of examples, you know, of Indigenous peoples in this one source, in this one sample size. But for them, you know, we listen to them talk about their communities, where they came from, because this is now an Indigenous community, you know, but they're from their nations, right? They're from their First Nations, and they would talk about their different experiences, and they had different ages and so on. But yeah, a common thread in each of them was yeah, just the understanding of the 7 teachings. You know, that was they all knew what that was. They all knew what the 7 teachings were. And it came up in a lot of the group discussions. And so the question was, so how do we take these 7 teachings and incorporate them into our model? And I think that was one of the causes of the similarity, because you look at those 7 teachings and you look at what the cooperative model is for, and it sort of naturally pulls you into that. So yeah, I think there's a lot of dynamics in play, but those are some of my thoughts in terms of why we saw that trend.
Okay, thank you. Last question.
Mhm.
And you look at this from a urban Indigenous community perspective, and clearly the land base, the reserve. Could you talk about why it might work and might not work in that setting?
Yeah, so economic development in an urban versus a First Nation are they're different. There's a lot of differences. It's like it's a different beast, because in a First Nation, a lot of the economic development could be done by the elected chief and council, and there's a lot more resource, like there's a lot more, I hesitate to say resources, but decision-making authority and that kind of thing. There's advantages that they would have that the individual members may not, but economic development still happens on the individual level as well. In depending on the location of the First Nation, then there will be a lot more challenges to overcome, but then a lot more rewards if you're able to set up that business. In an urban setting, a leader is whoever exudes leadership. And so we talked about this a little bit in our report, but traditional leadership, not outside of the Indian Act, is understood as it's a function, it's a service. A leader serves, and so in this area, you would have somebody who has more of a traditional sense of leadership as sort of this person is serving the group in order to achieve the ends that the group is trying to achieve. And so so you have that dynamic. So then it's so you have people from different First Nations, different identities, different languages, backgrounds, and affiliations coming together in the urban context, and but still having a sense of community. Just because this is where we live, we live in this area. In our case, we look at the Winnipeg's north end, and so in that context, so these are the different dynamics. And so access to capital and how you access capital is different. How you organize yourself is different. How you make decisions will be different. Yeah. So there's a couple of the similarities and differences.
Thank you.
Yeah, for sure.
Wow, those are really great questions. Thank you. In the chat box, Jimmy, I don't know if you had a chance to look, but the first one is, can Jimmy share his contact info with us? Do you have a website that you can point us towards where we can connect with you if we have any questions?
Yeah. So I have one website that I have is reconciliationthunder.org. In that website, that's more related to the work I do with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and public education on that area, but people are welcome to check out that website as well. And then my email under that is jimmy@reconciliationthunder.org. And yeah, so those are two of the probably the best ways to connect. It looks like there's another question here. It says, what level of support have you seen for the co-op model in Indigenous communities? And so when I was working for the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs, we were very hesitant to use the model Indigenous communities, because we were talking, especially when we're talking specifically about First Nations. And so that's a distinction to make, because in our research, we use the term Indigenous community because that's what we're talking about, Indigenous community, because it included First Nation, Inuit, Métis, and a community is broadly defined as a community. So when we're talking about a First Nation then it's specifically First Nation and that kind of a thing. So I'm curious if whether the question is I'm assuming that the question is talking about First Nations rather than Indigenous communities, generally speaking. So making that assumption, what level of support have I seen for the co-op model in First Nations? Personally, so I'm working as a director of economic development for Norhouse. And so I've seen, there's a lot of resources available for us. In fact, I think we're exploring building a cooperative in the business center that we are building. So so there's lots of resources. Yeah, so there's lots of resources available through, Cooperatives First has met with us, and we've met Dwayne Wilson from Arctic Co-op, and so I think it's if a First Nation wants to, like in our case, we've seen a lot of support. Looks like there's another question. Are there any co-op models that currently exist in First Nations or Indigenous communities? If so, how are they being received? Any co-op models that currently exist in First Nation, Indigenous communities? If so, how are they being received? I'm not entirely sure how to answer the question. In our case, when we were writing our research, as I mentioned, we were trying to be descriptive rather than prescriptive. So we're not trying to create a model that says this is how an Indigenous cooperative could look. Because I think that every Indigenous co-op could be unique. But that being the case, I guess you would have First Nations that will have their own co-op. And I know that there are a number of co-ops that exist in First Nations across Canada. I know that Arctic Co-op has a huge number of First Nations that have co-ops, and I think for each of those, they're unique. When we interviewed Dwayne Wilson from Arctic Co-op, he was talking about like every co-op is its own unique creation, because it's defined by the members. The members define what their principles are, what their values are, what their service offerings are going to be, and how they're going to treat their members. So so I think each one is its own, and this is one of the reasons why we tried to be descriptive rather than prescriptive, is because that's the very nature of it. It creates their own each one creates its own model. Essentially, every new cooperative is its own model of a cooperative. And so how are they being received? Very well. There are a lot of success stories. A lot of the cooperatives that I've heard about, the people are happy with them. They're enjoying having them. There's a specific example whose name escapes me, but they had a northern store for many years, and they were unhappy with the product offering, and they were unhappy with the upkeep of the store. So they created their own cooperative, and it's become like a source of pride for the whole community. They're able to keep it up to they're able to maintain the building. I think they've gone through their third building now, and it's just a source of pride for the community. So I wish I could tell you the name of that community, but that's one that Dwayne Wilson seems to talk about a lot. But yeah.
Well, thanks, Jimmy. I think that's the beauty of a cooperative, that it's fluid. You can breathe life into it as you see, your community needs. And I just think it's beautiful. Really good knowledge that you brought. I really also appreciate at the very beginning, you touched on the Indian Act, and, how perhaps we were constrained as a people, and where we are growing and developing for the last, many, many years. So I really appreciated that little history piece. So thank you for bringing that. Larry got a question. What barriers do you see regarding First Nations going down the path of co-op type models? That's a good question, Larry.
Yeah, so First Nations here specifically is so one of the challenges are so if a First Nation is developing a cooperative, it's they have to so they need to recognize what the cooperative model is, because developing a co-op isn't the same as developing a store. So if a First Nation wants to develop a store, then they can have ownership of the store. They determine the governance model. They determine who works there, and then they can choose to keep it, and it becomes a band-owned entity, or it can separate. So that's if you're just building a store. If you build a co-op, then from the very beginning, as soon as you start it, you get your band members, and maybe you invest the capital, but then it's gone. Then it's your community's entity for them to take and to use and to run with. So if the First Nation is investing into that model using First Nations funds, own source revenue, or whatever it is, then it's just recognizing that whoever you put in there, then that's theirs. That's something that you're giving to the community. So I think that's one of the barriers in terms of the development. Also, just like in general, like other economic development general barriers that you might find. So access to capital is challenging. We have now the FNFA, which if First Nations are able to get certified, it opens the door for additional funding, additional loans, low interest loans. If as a First Nation, if we're trying to secure capital funding for investment, we have to fill out a Let's Be or a Corp application, and funding there is always limited, and it's not approved always. Also, structuring, having an economic development strategy. The First Nation has a lot of different entities, a lot of different players, and they don't have a centralized economic development strategy and a long-term focus. That's a barrier not only for the development of a co-op, but all economic development activities. So those are a couple of barriers.
Thank you. I think we have one. No, we're going to say, Jimmy, you brought the knowledge today. Thank you so much. It was very thorough, very informative. Again, I always feel inspired at the possibilities of growth, what we're seeing in our communities and in our urban places where we live. And it's a beautiful thing. So thank you for coming and joining us today. And everybody else, thank you for being here. And I hope you walk away with, inspired like myself. And again, acknowledging where we were as a people, the history, and where we are now, and all of the barriers, all of the restraints, the constraints that we had on as a people, again, reminds us that we're a strong, resilient people. So thank you for that. Thank you all for joining. We'll see you next time. Take care, everyone.
Take care, everyone.